Okay, so we have a little disclaimer, and as I mentioned earlier, the interview will be viewed by students studying for their degree in business at Nichols College in Dudley, Massachusetts. And I just have to ask, do I have the consent to ask a few questions and play it for the class?
You do have my consent, you bet.
Thank you, sir. So today I'd like to introduce, do you like Charles or Chuck?
Chuck, that way Charles is for when you're mad at me.
I'll remember that. I
Yeah.
have a good friend, colleague, Chuck Nemer, who's got a business called the Guru of Business, really focused more on supply chain and leadership management. But he certainly has some experience in operations and project management. And so, I think it gives us a different perspective. So first of all, Chuck, thank you for being with us. And can you just give me a little bit of background on what you do and who you are?
Yeah, golly, what do I do? I pretty much focus in on training in the whole supply chain area. Been in supply chain for 40 some years, and when the dot-com bust hit, I lost my job, and so I went into training full time and had done training on the APIC certifications beforehand, and I still do that today. Who I am, probably parts supply chain fanatic. I never thought I'd do that. Really love the training part of it and helping people learn. And also, of course, like many folks, spouse, dad, everything else, closing in on retirement and all that fun stuff. But yeah, really love the supply chain part and teaching people how not just how cool it is, but also how it's really how work gets done. So that's kind of the nickel tour, I guess.
Well, I think that it's probably one of the aspects of business that has changed the most with technology. I think other people might argue, but I think as supply chain operations people, we have seen technology change so fast, our industry.
It's not a good old days comment. I started sourcing in 78, went into manufacturing, didn't even have computers. So all the planning we do today with SAP and everything, it was all done on note cards and, adding machines and things like that. And I don't care what anybody says, that was not the good old days. And so when computers came around, it was fabulous. And, what we've got for ERP systems and what's coming for digitization, honestly, love to be 20 years younger.
Yeah. And just to pile onto that, I had somebody come from Boeing and talk to one of my classes at the University of Idaho. And he didn't know, what's a PERT chart, what's a Gantt chart. He just used the old system, like you're explaining, where you had different colored paper up on a wall. And when the project was completed, it would sign off by whoever the team leader was and put in a drawer. So, but I think it gave us a good foundation. So, what type of projects are typical in your field, in your business?
Yeah, for myself today, I mean, again, we're looking at the context from training. Every time I get an engagement from somebody, that's part of a whole project, both up front and during the creation and the delivery. So if you take that concept of a Gantt chart, as the example, I start out from a forward scheduling standpoint. I got to do this first, second, third, and fourth. And that includes the investigation, talking to the potential client, what's the objectives, what's the learning outcomes, yada, yada, yada. And then once I get that mapped out, I start talking with the the client on it. And as things firm up, one of the first things I talk about is the due date, because I want to shift to a backward scheduling mode. So I can say, okay, to start the delivery by this date, I got to do this before this before this. I mean, I literally, and to me, project management is like MRP, but a lot size of one. I'm using that same backwards mentality to figure out what has to be done in steps. And so I very much, for the whole educational experience, including afterwards, follow-ups and everything else, it's like one big Microsoft project that I'll use. I don't use project myself. I have, and I know it. In my kind of work, it's a little over the top for what I need. And quite honestly, I don't think I'm being cheap, but I'm not ready to spend $700 a year for something like that. So I use some of the softwares out there like Trello and some of the other ones, which you manually move things through stages on a screen, but it's a simplified form of what Microsoft Project or project management does. So I literally map it over for steps to figure out how to create the whole project and make sure I get things done on time. And then, of course, there's always the human aspect that no project management can capture. Is without thinking about it, I'll double book something or double schedule something or procrastinate, and then I got to go into expedite mode, like the critical path. So yeah, I think I still use the same logic there too.
So you mentioned, a couple of acronyms, and these guys have been through some business classes, but their backgrounds and their careers are very, very diversified. MRP, explain MRP.
Yep, materials requirements planning, and so it's really high tech here. I'm going to do it on the screen here, and I got to realize I'm working backwards here. But if something's got to be done by September 1st, and it takes 10 days to do it, then you back up and say, well, by August 20th, I've got to get this done to do this by August 20th. The steps before that take time. I guess the metaphor I use in class is MRP is like what you and I go through when we try to get to work on time. We work backwards to figure out when I have to get up so I get to work on time. And then I find out, ooh, I can hit the alarm 3 more times, and still sleep in or something. So it's materials requirements planning, but it's that whole working backwards to figure out what has to happen by when. And we do that for supply chain all the time.
And I never really thought of it as another project management tool, but it really is, because, as you're talking about working backwards, it also is planning your materials and when you need materials, how much you need. And I'll use another acronym we use in the industry a lot is just in time, or JIT, is making sure that we're not loaded up with too much inventory. So it really truly is a project management tool all in of itself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I'll take the risk in a humorous and affectionate way, but I'd suspect the students that you and I teach, and I don't know if we're any different as professors, we kind of go through that backward scheduling to see, how long I can go before I have to do something too.
So in some of your consulting businesses where you're working with industries, and you start looking at their supply chains, what kind of tools, or how do you approach something like that? Is it any different than how you approach a training session?
I don't think so, because it still has that same element of, number one, where do you want to end up in this conversation working on the consulting, on a consulting gig? I want to be able to do this by this way and whatever. And then it's almost like a logical conversation backwards in the consulting. It reminds me somewhat, it may be something you'll have to explain to folks, but in Six Sigma, they got SIPOC as an acronym. It has an element to that, is I'm looking at them as my customer and saying, okay, what do you want to end up with? What does the outcome look like? Then I got to go back and figure out the process with you to get there. And then I have to look at the inputs to be able to do what you're asking me to do. And then I got to go back upstream to my suppliers, so to speak, to say, hey, here's what we need to do. So yeah, I would agree with you. Even though it's not a training class, that logic still of necessary required steps beforehand, just to kind of frame it out, is part of any engagement.
So leadership, what is your project management leadership style? So you talked a little bit about some initial and during, but how does that conversation work with your clients?
Pretty well. I'm hesitating because it's I always struggle a little bit with the organizational dynamics and politics a little bit, and I don't mean that terribly or anything like that. But from a leadership style, I tend to, and it probably comes from because I work for myself, but also trying to help people solve something, is kind of that element of, it probably comes out of lean with the value stream mapping, I suppose, with the, we want to get here, where are we today? What's the gap in between? So I tend to be very to the point. I mean, I'm polite, respectful. From a leadership, I listen to people. I want to understand what's spoken as well as kind of what's underneath. So all the traditional traits that we have for good leaders, or what we want in leaders, I try to emulate myself. I probably fall in the category of probably like servant leaders. How do I help you succeed type of orientation? But it's, hey, let's get together, let's talk about it, let's figure it out, let's build the path, let's get going on it. And I always tend to get a little frustrated, I'll confess. And that's, I think, when I realized I was probably, ultimately better as a trainer, is kind of the organizational politics that can occur in any size company drives me bonkers. And it's just like, really, we're trying to get stuff done and make a difference. And so I got to confess, that's probably my hot spot.
So how do we get past that? Any suggestions?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, on an intellectual basis, I mean, we would probably, I would say, let's sit down and talk about what the dynamic is and going on behind the scenes and what causes it. I think I fall into the category of, okay, I understand it. I get what you're saying. Don't know that I like it, but I understand what you're saying. How do we accomplish what you need plus the project so you both win? I guess that's how I tend to do it. Part of that probably comes from, I'm not a high confrontation person. I don't like conflict. So it's, again, back into that service, servant leadership or collaborative, or whatever you want to call it, is how do we both get what we need?
So how frequently and what tools do you use? And do you put that in your project planning process of how often you're going to talk to somebody and how you're going to talk to somebody?
I haven't had to do it in a while, to be honest. When it does come up, I tend to add probably 10 to 15% of time on top of, knowing that these things are going to come up. And so I allow space it's kind of part of the lead time, if you want to call it, to make sure that we have time to talk about those things. From a tool standpoint, it's I document what the conversations are. I share it with the other person because I want them to understand. I know it's a risky situation, but I also document it in terms of, we bumped into this situation, so I'm staying away from names and whatever, where people get a little testy about those kind of things. So in the case, more often than not, it's going to be either documenting a conversation. If it's a process, it's going to be, what would be again, I draw back on the lean tools, what would be the ideal state, and work backwards into multiple ways we can solve that. And so, when I had to do it was in healthcare last, we pulled out an A3 and worked through an A3 document to kind of help them see what the options are. And was also reminding them about the idea that, hey, any time we can free up and open up is less pressure on your shoulders. So I think, I don't know if it's probably I don't know if you'd call it a tool, but it's that helping them understand how do we build some space for them to be able to think and have time to do things.
And just to clarify, an A3 document.
Yeah, an A3, my understanding, and it could be urban myth, be honest with you. I thought I read somewhere, I mean, A3 is the size of a piece of paper.
Right.
Compared to the US. And my understanding was, and again, I read it, don't know if it's true, but I thought I heard that when Toyota was designing the Prius, they did it on an A3, and an A3 takes you through typically 9 or 10 logical steps to really think it through. And the argument was, I find it kind of humorous, and I'd love to know if it's true, they were in the process of selecting new engineers, and whoever could explain the project best on an A3 got the job. It sounds like it's way too cool to have it happen that way. but an A3 really forces you to logically walk through that. Hey, you got to understand, if you want to get this result, you got to do this beforehand. And if you want to get this, you got to look at this and this and this. And this. Again, I hadn't thought about it, but it's in our conversation here. It's kind of like backward scheduling, but more in a logical conversation or problem solving mode.
Thank you. So do you have a project? This is a tough one to kind of bring up, but a project that was that project from hell, I guess, if you will, or that project that, you just kind of either you work through it, or at some point you throw your hands up and you got to walk away. How do you put those benchmarks in so when it is time maybe to walk away from a project? What does that look like? Or have you ever had that?
Yeah, I haven't had it. I've probably been lucky that way. I can think of a couple that if they ever came back, I'd probably have that walk away conversation. Um, it's usually, I think back to when I was a materials manager and we were doing reviews with people. By the time you got to the review, it shouldn't be a surprise to either side. So I think I always had those conversations ahead of time to try and head off a lot of those things. um i think I think today I've gotten a lot better at catching those before I go into an engagement, to be able to say, hey, I just don't think this is working. We're not going to go into this on the right page. So we need to do that. It's gotten easier to do as I've gotten more stable in my business. There's nothing more powerful than being able to say no and know it's not going to hurt you financially. I mean, I couldn't pull that off at 23. So I think I try to head those off as much as I can. I think I have rationalized it in my head to say, if it did come up, I've documented it, and I can sit down with the person and say, we keep running into this, and this, and here's what keeps happening, and we're not moving forward. It feels like there's a refusal to do it. I think we ought to part ways. So I think in my head, I've kind of mentally written that script and I know what to watch for, but knock on wood, I may make it to retirement before I have to do that.
Well, great transition as far as change is, how do you handle change when they come back and they do want to change something? And obviously or not obviously, but potentially it could change the scope, the budget, or the schedule. How do you handle that with a client?
I've gotten really good and at saying it fairly. That says, okay, we can do it, but here's what it means. If you want to do that, then we're going to have to do this, and this, which is going to impact the timeline. And, and so it's almost like the carnival game with whack-a-mole. When you look at the three elements of a project, it's what is it? Time, cost, or scope, or something like that. Yeah. And I've gotten pretty darn good at saying, hey, I can do that, but it's going to cost over here. Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, then if we don't want to do that, then something's got to give over here. What do you want to do? And the couple of times I've had to do it, I think folks have picked up on what I'm doing, but I'm saying, okay, there's no free lunch out of this thing. Something's got to give. And I think when it comes down to, for myself, when it comes down to they're not willing to spend the time or resources, be it dollars, whatever, is saying, okay, for what you want to put constraints on, this is as far as I can get. There's no magic, unless you want to do it yourself instead of me, which is okay. That's the ultimate, if you can figure it out yourself. But there's no magic. So tell me what you want to do. It's just, I'm not going to promise something to you that I can't keep. That would be, that's either gaslighting you or that's blowing smoke by you or something. And that's just old school ethics, I guess, at that point.
So to go back, A3 document important in this one to get everybody to sign off on it, or is verbal okay in your world?
I'm naive enough still at this age in my life that I'll take people on their words a bit. But I do that a whole heck of a lot less than I used to. I get pretty good now about documenting things, sending out copies, emailing, hey, this is what we agreed to. And it goes into the file or the computer file and gets saved. Because more often than not, it seems like when you don't do that, that's when it comes back to bite you. So yeah, it's not a matter of trust. It's just a good business practice. And golly, my wife and I ran into that when we built our house 20 some years ago. We kept all the paperwork of all the conversations and everything else, told them we wanted one set of closing costs, and we get to closing And the financial guy says, oh, we got 2 sets of closing costs. We got one for the house and one for the construction loan. And we're like, no. We says 1 set of costs. We went back and forth. We had this stack of paper like this. We pulled it out. We showed it to him. And he said, well, we can't do it. You got to pay the extra X $1,000. My wife, God bless her soul, I'm in sourcing. I should be able to negotiate. I couldn't do it. She got up, furious, walked out of the room, and now the house is done. And we're just closing to get the keys. My wife stands up and walks out of the room and says, you can take the house and stick it. And we're all like, whoa. I mean, there's a negotiating tip I should learn. But they caved on it because everything was documented. And yeah, it makes sense to, even though we want to give people the best intentions, you owe it to the company you work for to protect their resources and assets. So you should document those things. But that was a hard one for me to learn. I learned it after that, though, I'll tell you that.